So, dobry den. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the warm welcome, Victoria, and leading me onto the stage. I'm happy and humbled to be presenting to you all today in Prague, which is now more or less my adopted city. Despite having a Czech surname and actually living in Prague, it's not where I grew up. I actually grew up in Australia, many thousands of kilometres away from here. And not only was the weather pretty different, my life was as well. I wasn't working on animal rights, I was working in a different field. In fact, it was a pretty different field. I was working in mining. Apart from mining being quite a big danger to our planet, it's also a pretty big danger to the people that work inside them. My first job, in fact, was in a coal mine. And when you think of workplace conditions, they don't really get much worse than a coal mine. It's dark, it's hot, it's smelly, it's wet, and practically everyone dies too young via injury or illness. However, the conditions only a few decades earlier were significantly worse. Injuries and death were the norm rather than the exception. So what has changed? How were they able to improve working conditions? The answer was labour unions, or trade unions, as they are otherwise known. These unions were able to represent the individuals who worked in the mine, who were often poorly educated, unaware of their rights, versus the mine owners, to create better conditions for the workers. Labour unions have been successful all over the world by sticking to a few simple principles. They are organised, aligned, and skilled negotiators. The results being better wages, better working conditions, and health benefits for the people they represent. Essentially, all trade unions follow a simple formula. They develop amongst themselves a reasonable ask that aims to improve their conditions. They then gain alignment, and then they take seemingly unreasonable action to force the decision makers to bring the change into force, ultimately creating better conditions for the workers. So now, fast forward a couple of years, I'm in Europe, I'm working in animal rights. And when I think of living conditions, I can't really think of any worse than those of egg-laying hens. Crammed into small spaces where it stinks, it's hot, they're often injured, and practically all of them die too young via injury, illness, or slaughter. They're deprived of their natural instinct to perch. They're deprived of their natural instinct to dust bathe, a practice to clean themselves, keeping them free of mites, lice, and other parasites. They're deprived of their natural instinct to nest. And perhaps, most symbolically, they're deprived of their natural instinct to spread their wings. It's clear they suffer throughout their entire lives. Their conditions are one of the worst in factory farming. And unlike the conditions, which at the time I considered were pretty tough in mining, there are a few key differences. The hens don't have a choice to be there. They aren't able to voice their dissatisfaction, nor are they able to leave these terrible conditions and go home. This is their home. This is their home for the entire duration of their short lives. Fortunately, there are people and organisations that realise that this practice is unfair and unjust, and have decided to speak up and end the practice of caging hens for eggs. Many of these leading animal advocacy organisations have come together under the banner of the Open Wing Alliance, which was formed by the Humane League in 2016 to create a unified front to work on eradicating the practice of caging egg-laying hens. As it stands now, it's now a coalition of 60 organisations spread across more than 50 countries and 6 continents, while working with the common goal to end cages globally. So similar to the trade unions and how they've brought about change amongst their members, better conditions for hens are being created by using a similar approach. The reasonable ask is cage-free eggs. We're aligned as we'll only accept 100% cage-free egg commitments, and when companies don't want to reduce the suffering of animals in their supply chain, public awareness campaigns are launched to show the extreme animal cruelty that these companies support, with the result being better conditions for these hens. So when you look at the egg supply chain, there are a whole range of actors, starting at the farms, distributors, restaurants, retailers, and ultimately to individual consumers. Pressure on all parts of the supply chain is necessary and needed in order to bring about a better world for animals. But where can we, as campaigning organisations, bring about this change most effectively? Corporations. Why corporations? Corporations are the interface between the public and the private of the factory farming world. They have the power to affect large number of animals. Distributors and producers rely on them. Some of these companies are responsible for over 10% of all egg purchasing in their specific regions. It's also much faster and easier than changing the law. It's faster than changing human individual behaviour. If we take, for example, Sodexo, which is one of the world's biggest catering companies, they serve daily 75 million meals. So if you can imagine how long it will take to change the individual behaviour of 75 million people versus the behaviour of one company, you see that this is an effective strategy. These companies also want to please the public. They rely on individual consumers coming and buying from them, which makes them extremely vulnerable to public pressure. Corporations, whilst often appearing faceless, are actually made up of individual people. And often it is just a few people at a company who are responsible for making the big decisions. And it's these few people who are the barrier between us and helping millions of animals. Fortunately, most of these people can appreciate that they are supporting extreme animal suffering by continuing to buy and serve eggs from these caged hens. And all that is necessary is for us to educate them with a presentation showing that the cruelty they support and a clear ask to eliminate cage eggs from their supply chain. However, there are a few exceptions to this. Some executives refuse to make this change, and so instead of educating them, we are forced to educate their consumers. This takes the form of public awareness campaigns that lead to their customers becoming aware of what's happening in that company's supply chain. The customers then start calling on the company to make this change or lose their business. This ultimately leaves the company with no alternative but to make a commitment to supply completely cage-free eggs if they want to gain back the respect and business of their customers. The progress at the beginning of these campaigns were considered pretty small by today's standards. For the Humane League, the organisation I work for, it was inspired by the work of activists in Europe who were working to eradicate battery cages in the early 2000s. So the Humane League set to work on this issue in the US, and their campaign started with some victories that were considered very small by today's standards. They would go from college campus to college campus, asking their cafeterias and campaigning to go cage-free. It was a lot of work for small wins, and eventually they'd achieved around 100 commitments from college campuses all over the country. This laid the groundwork for some of the first corporate commitments in the US. Again, these commitments were considered quite small by today's standards. These companies were committing, in some cases, to converting just 2% of their egg supply to cage-free. But we need to take into account the context at the time. these were some of the first policies and statements by these companies to improve the welfare of animals, and it primed them and set them up for the change that was set to come. From these small commitments, progress really started to accelerate in the US. And it happened when organisations, apart from the Humane League, also started making farm animals a priority and approaching companies with the same ask: to end cages for egg-laying hens. What followed exceeded many people's expectations, with all major retailers, all major restaurant chains, all major manufacturers, and all major food service companies in the US releasing commitments to completely eradicate eggs from their supply chain. This has subsequently been followed by many of the nation's largest egg producers committing to do the same. In total, there's over 300 cage-free egg commitments in the US. So how has this affected the supply? Many of these commitments came out from 2014 to 2017, and during that time, we've seen cage-free egg layer flocks nearly triple. Now, with many of these companies' deadlines coming into force, we expect these figures to rise even faster. The egg industry, that only a few years earlier was saying that cage-free on a large scale was impossible, are now predicting, this is their statement, that 72% of the total US layer flock will be cage-free by 2025. Something they'd said would be impossible years earlier. Something the US egg industry also said would happen was that egg prices would increase, and that by making these higher welfare, the consumer would suffer. But in fact, the contrary has happened. Egg prices have stayed the same as cage-free egg supply has increased. The spikes in price, instead, have correlated with disease, such as bird flu or avian flu. And it's reinforced the principle that higher welfare does not have to equal higher costs. Progress in the US was happening, and a huge part of it was thanks to the collaboration of various organisations in the US itself. However, many of the companies that have made these commitments had limited them to only the US, despite many of them operating internationally. It was clear that in order to eradicate the practice of caging egg-laying hens, there would need to be international collaboration. A big part of this collaboration in the beginning was linking up with strong groups in Europe. Groups like Anima and Open Cages, who have since merged to Anima International, have completely transformed the landscape in their respective countries and are now also driving changes in parts of Europe that haven't had long histories of animal advocacy. As well as L214 in France. France has gone from a country that around 2 years ago didn't have a single cage-free egg commitment to this point it's at today, where practically every company has a cage-free egg commitment. And earlier this week, we saw France's largest egg producer and the largest egg producer in the EU make a commitment to completely eradicate shell eggs, cage-free shell eggs from its supply chain by 2025.
Wow.
These early successful collaborations have allowed global collaboration in animal advocacy to flourish, with groups all over the world now working to end cages. This is ultimately what is needed to stop this animal cruelty. As we've seen with fur bans and circus bans, when they happen in individual countries, the companies just pack up and move to neighbouring countries where they're not banned. Or in the case of eggs, a prime example is Switzerland, where the production of cage eggs is banned, but supply from other countries continues to pour into the country for sale. It is clear that European collaboration was and is still needed. Groups are now working in every European country to stop cages, and the progress has been incredible. At the end of 2017, we're now in a position where 47% of the European egg-laying flock are out of cages, and 44% of the eggs are from cage-free sources. It is very likely that 2018 will be the year when more hens are out of cages than in them. This growing percentage of chickens out of cages is thanks to legislative change and the hundreds of European corporate cage-free egg commitments that groups right throughout the continent have been working on over the previous years. That pressure is now being felt all the way throughout the supply chain, with the EU's two largest egg producers, Noble Foods and Martin, now having committed to completely cage-free egg production by 2025 at the latest. This has, of course, led to a number of other egg producers in France, Norway, and the UK making similar commitments. The Noble Foods commitment came after a public 6-month campaign against the company. The Martin commitment was released before the campaign even came into full effect, which gives us increasing confidence that more European producers will be making similar commitments in the very near future. In fact, in the UK, consumer support for higher welfare eggs has grown so much that earlier this year, free-range egg production overtook that of cage production for the first time and now makes up 53% of the entire UK egg production. Alongside these developments in Europe, similar collaboration and progress has been happening in Latin America. We've seen huge companies, such as the largest baking company on earth, Grupo Bimbo, make a global cage-free egg commitment, alongside the largest restaurant operators and meat processor on the continent. In total, there are now over 120 cage-free egg commitments in this region. This is great. Progress is being made. But if we look at this graphic, we see that only 35% of global egg production takes place in Europe and the Americas. We still need to consider Asia, where a whopping 61% of egg production takes place, and Africa, that contributes 5% to egg production. Much of the progress in Asia to date has been as a result from international businesses making global policies that include Asian countries. This is only possible with international collaboration in the animal advocacy space. This has also been a great way to accelerate global momentum, where we first see a company make a commitment in their home country, then going on to extend it in a region such as Europe, and then going on to create a truly global policy. This then lays a precedent for local operators in these countries to match their commitment and further build on these welfare improvements. A great recent example of this is French retailer Carrefour. Originally, French group L214 worked with Carrefour to implement a French cage-free egg policy in 2016. Following further discussions with L214 and members of the Open Wing Alliance, Carrefour extended this commitment to cover the whole of Europe in 2017. And just this year, they have again expanded it to include Taiwan and Brazil. This is a common trend where we see companies, after making a cage-free commitment in their home country, gain the confidence and understanding of the issue and go on to implement it in more regions where they're operating around the world. This, of course, opens up regions to more progress. For example, Carrefour's commitment in Taiwan was not only the first by a supermarket in Taiwan, but also the first by a retailer in Asia. And this was the result of international cooperation by animal advocacy organisations. Recent talks with other retailers operating in the area indicates that we can expect a number of them to make commitments in the region very shortly. We're now also seeing investment into cage-free in Asia. In China, cage-free currently accounts for around 10% of their supply. And just this year, we saw Nestle, which is the world's biggest food company, investing into cage-free systems in China. This is to increase the supply that would enable them to make and meet their global, they've already made their commitment, but to meet their global cage-free egg commitment. In Singapore, we're also excited to see the first local commitments come out from Grand Hyatt and Andaz, I think earlier last month, which has opened the door for more companies to follow. And as the global companies start to translate their global commitments into local languages, such as in Japan, we're seeing the poultry industry wake up to this change. The poultry industry in Japan is reporting the cage-free movement is coming to Japan, and that producers in Japan need to come up with a solution and need to be ready for the cage-free movement as soon as possible. Local groups are now working increasingly harder to increase the cage-free commitment progress in Asia, and are expecting progress to significantly increase over the coming months. African groups are now starting to work on the cage-free topic, and the egg industry there has also taken note, saying, "The cage-free revolution is moving rapidly throughout the world, and the South African egg industry should make sure that they are prepared to accommodate the change." So by this time, perhaps there's a number of you in the audience that have this sort of feeling. Is this really a win for animals, or is this really progress? Until all cages are empty, all animals are free, we really haven't achieved anything. If you really believe this, I recommend coming to my colleague Aaron Ross's talk tomorrow at noon, where he'll compare the animal rights movement with other social movements and hopefully change your opinion. But apart from the primary impact of reducing the suffering of egg-laying hens, there are a number of secondary benefits that have come from this global cage-free movement. Collaboration is happening within the animal rights movement all over the globe. This graphic shows the size of only the advertising budgets of a number of major food companies in the US versus the entire budgets of all the animal advocacy organizations in the US. You can see we have a huge task ahead of us, and collaboration allows us to act as one animal rights supergroup. To make a change for animals, we need to combine our resources as well as the strengths of the various organizations. Some organizations do great undercover investigations. Some groups have strong volunteer networks. And combining these with good cop organizations that have strong relationships with companies and the public, we really are an unstoppable force. This global network of animal groups sharing information means that we have the best understanding of what is happening in the egg industry globally and are hyper aware of where and when we should be focusing our efforts. This is also increasingly the case for a number of other issues. Speaking of other issues, in many cases, a cage-free commitment is the first animal welfare statement many of these companies have ever made. In many cases, just meeting with the company prompts them to develop a general animal welfare policy and investigate the welfare of other animals they're using in their supply chain, building the foundation for further improvements for animals in the future. We're also helping to create conditions for real disruption in factory farming. Many companies are now beginning to see eggs and animal proteins as a liability and are looking for alternate options, which creates many opportunities for plant-based alternatives to get a foothold in the market. The collaborative nature of our work is prompting many of us to work together on projects and campaigns, which ultimately leads to bonds being built. This is helping to limit destructive infighting and also provides encouragement when, of course, we succeed and support when we inevitably fail. But perhaps one of the biggest benefits has been the influx of funds and professionalization of our organizations and the movement in general. The success of the Cage-Free campaign in the US led to significant funding from the Open Philanthropy Project, and as global momentum has grown, significant amounts of funding and resources have been poured into farm animal organizations around the world. This is funding that ultimately allows us to give animals a bigger and stronger voice and will bring us closer to a world where animals aren't suffering. But with all this success and collaboration, it's easy for things to go astray, and there are a few things we need to keep in check. Of course, starting with our ego. Clear protocols within collaborating organisations where we work, especially in how credit is shared, helps significantly in this regard. And when it comes to victories, it can also be sort of a weakness, as communication can quickly become all about bragging and showing off to each other, which is fine, but often the most useful things to talk about, if we really want to do the best for animals, are our failures and challenges. These can be difficult to open up about and share, but discussing these with colleagues can not only help us solve these challenges, but also prevent others from repeating them. Challenges from collaboration can also arise in our day-to-day contact, and misunderstandings and conflict are really inevitable. Fortunately, my experience in this movement so far has been that people will speak up about it and try to resolve it, so we can move on and make the changes for billions of animals that are suffering every day. If you really think about it, we're a tiny percentage of people that are working in this movement, and we all have good intentions. So it's really just about keeping this in mind when dealing with others. As together, we're so much stronger, and we really need everyone's 100% if we're going to succeed. But perhaps the greatest thing that has come from the global cage-free movement and all of this collaboration is the experience and ability to launch global campaigns. Many of the companies that dominate the food industry are global, and when they refuse to take concrete steps to improve the welfare of animals, there are now organisations and activists globally that are ready to shine the spotlight on the extreme animal cruelty they support, showing these companies that people care about these issues all over the world. The last major global public awareness campaign was launched by the Open Wing Alliance earlier this year in Prague against Starbucks, after months of unproductive dialogue. Of course, it ultimately led to Starbucks producing a global cage-free egg commitment. So to recap on the progress of the movement so far, we've now seen the 4 largest global catering companies make cage-free egg commitments. All of the major global food manufacturers have global cage-free policies, with many of them operating in practically every country on this planet. A number of major global restaurant chains have made international cage-free commitments, and recently, as I said, Starbucks released their global cage-free policy following the coordinated campaign. In the retail sector, we're seeing the largest and fastest growing supermarket chains on earth going cage-free internationally, with a number of global commitments from Aldi Sud, Aldi Nord, as well as Rewe. In terms of legislation, the entire European Union banned battery cages in 2012. Germany, Switzerland, and Austria have gone further with bans on all types of cages, and 2 weeks ago we saw the same in the Belgian province of Wallonia. 6 states in the US ban or severely restrict the use of cages. All major egg-producing countries in the European Union are phasing out cages through either legislative or corporate policy, and the European Citizens' Initiative to ban cages for all animals in the EU has been launched in September. It's now gathering 1 million signatures. I believe Mandy Carter is talking about this right now in another room, and not only will this initiative have the ability to end cages for hens, but it will end them for all animals. With practically all major companies having made commitments in Europe, as well as a number of producers heading in this direction, the reality of this happening is looking increasingly promising. So in terms of the global industries, food service is finished. The hotel industry is almost complete. The global retail sector is making steady progress, and we're now in a position where momentum has built up in the global restaurant sector, and we can look forward to a number of commitments coming out over the coming months. The cage-free movement has established a strong foothold in Asia, the largest egg producer on Earth, and we're anticipating strong progress through the end of this year and into 2019. The progress to date and the future progress of the global cage-free movement is impressive, but it cannot be attributed to any one person or any one action. Instead, it has come about by many people, many organisations, and many actions to get to the point we're at today. We're a force of people that are fighting on behalf of all the animals that are suffering on factory farms. With so many animals suffering, it's easy to think we're trying to do the impossible. But when I reflect on my own life, previously I was a meat eater working in a mine. However, I saw the light and left that life. And now, only a couple of years later, I'm working to end the suffering of billions of animals on our planet today. Something that, 10 years ago, I definitely wouldn't have believed. So alongside people like you who are in the room today, I think we'll see the day when many of these animals can leave the darkness and no longer have to suffer needlessly.
So we have about 15 minutes. If anyone has some questions for Alex, I can come to you with the microphone. Any questions at all?
Hi, my name is Ulrik, and I was just thinking, like you had this picture of this lady with this, she was complaining about that it's only cage-free, So I'm just thinking when all the hens are cage-free, I'm just thinking, how do you move people from the belief that this is humane? Now we have established a humane way of having these animals. How do we then break it to them that, oh no, this is not humane, this is also not bad? So that's just my concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I had this concern myself like a couple of years ago, and one thing that was really useful for me, I saw is there's a guy, Martin Baluk, and he's doing a presentation this weekend, and I'm not sure if he'll talk about it, but he has a graph, and it shows where the bulk of society is, and like there's a little hole up here where vegans are, and it's all about making these changes to move this bulk of people closer towards this vegan sort of world, and it was quite helpful for me in understanding how this change can happen. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Thanks for the great news. I'm interested in India, which is one of the largest countries in the world. We haven't talked about it. How does the egg production industry look in there, and are there any activism groups looking into cage-free?
Yeah, there's groups working there, and I think about 2 or 3 months ago, they had a producer come out. It was more of like a niche producer rather than like a large producer, but the groundwork's there. A number of these global commitments impact India, and one thing that we're finding very useful is these companies translating it into whatever the local language is in the regions. This actually ends up being useful for the companies themselves because it creates sort of an even playing field. But yeah, I think the same thing is sort of happening there is what's happening in somewhere like Taiwan.
I'm wondering, have you monitored how animal welfare and their health has changed since going cage-free? Because, it's nice photos of animals free, but have you seen have you had any investigations of cage-free farms yet?
Yeah, good question. I think how this campaign started was with a clear ask. In a cage, there's a number of those natural behaviours which are just not possible. And you're right, once you move into a cage-free system, those behaviours are possible, but it's not 100% guaranteed. Recently, we're seeing more sort of, say, for want of a better word, like innovation in this area, where companies are moving forward with it. I'm not saying that cage-free farms are perfect, but for example, in the Netherlands, they're working on like some kipster system or something that's making these barn systems like more suitable for these hens.
Hi, thank you for the talk. A lot of these commitments have been made for around 2025. How can we be sure that companies will actually act on them?
Great question. Yeah, you're right. The commitments are made up to 2025. A number of companies, their commitments are coming into force from pretty much this year, 2018, they start building up. And I think one of the major things to ensure that all these companies come through with their commitments is to really ensure that these first ones happen. And like I said, we have a global network of organizations that are willing, able, and experienced to campaign. So I think the first companies that fail to come through with these commitments will really be made an example of, as one thing. Alongside that, there's also things like Egg Watch, which Compassion World Farming produces, and these companies report their progress, so we can see, just for example, like say Nestle maybe is like 20% transition to cage-free eggs now. So if it's 2024 and they're still 20%, it's quite clear that this change isn't going to happen. So there'll be pressure coming on like this.
Okay, so let's thank Alex for his talk, and thank you.
Thank you all.